You know, the start of World War II, it wasn't like a switch was flipped. It was more like a slow, creeping avalanche. A series of gambles, bluffs, and failures that piece by piece pulled the entire world into absolute chaos. So let's dig into how a series of calculated risks and just tragic miscalculations paved the road to a global catastrophe.
And really, that's the core question we're tackling here. How did the world go from this incredibly fragile peace to an all-out war in less than 10 years? Well, the answer lies in a series of aggressive moves that were met, time and time again, with nothing.
It all kicked off with a few, let's call them calculated risks. The future Axis powers started to poke and prod, testing the resolve of the international community, just pushing the boundaries to see exactly what they could get away with.
And just look at the pattern here. It's this rapid-fire series of tests. In 31, Japan invades Manchuria after basically faking an incident to justify it. The League of Nations makes some noise, and Japan, they literally just walk out. Then, in 35, Hitler just openly defies the Treaty of Versailles and starts rearming Germany. That same year, Mussolini goes after Ethiopia, and the sanctions they put on him are a total joke. They don't even cover oil. But the biggest bluff, the real high-stakes gamble, comes in 36. Hitler sends troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone. I mean, he was so nervous about this, his own generals had orders to pull back at the first sign of French resistance. But nothing happened. The Allies completely blinked.
And for the world's dictators, the lesson was crystal clear. The whole international system, the very thing designed to prevent another war, was hollow. It was a paper tiger. If you were bold enough, if you had the nerve, you could just take what you wanted. Aggression paid off.
So the next big event wasn't just another land grab. It was something different. It was basically a dress rehearsal for the main event. The Spanish Civil War became the world's bloody testing ground.
Spain turned into this brutal laboratory for the war that was just around the corner. Hitler and Mussolini jumped right in, using the war to test their new weapons and tactics, all in support of Franco's fascists. The German Luftwaffe perfected its dive-bombing techniques, which led to the horrifying bombing of Guernica, a truly terrifying preview of what aerial attacks on civilians would look like. And while the Soviet Union backed the Spanish Republic, what did the Western democracies do? They just sat on their hands, totally paralyzed by this policy of non-intervention.
This failure of will, it led directly to the West's defining policy of the era, appeasement. It was this desperate attempt to buy peace. But as we'll see, the price would be far, far too high.
So what exactly was appeasement? Well, it was the strategy of giving an aggressor what they claim to want, hoping, praying it'll prevent a bigger war. You got to remember, the leaders in Europe were absolutely haunted by the memory of the trenches in World War I. Some of them even thought they were correcting what they saw as unfair parts of the Versailles Treaty. The fatal flaw, though, was in how they read Hitler. They saw him as a regular politician with limited goals. They had no idea he was a radical ideologue with an infinite appetite.
And you can see this policy play out almost immediately. First, in March 1938, Hitler just annexes Austria, the Anschluss. The world protests, of course, but does absolutely nothing. Then comes the ultimate test, Czechoslovakia. Hitler demands the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. So at the infamous Munich conference, Britain and France, desperate for peace at any cost, agree. They literally force the Czechs, who weren't even invited to the meeting, to give it up.
British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew home from Munich looking like a hero. He stepped off the plane, waved that piece of paper, and declared to the world that he had secured peace for our time. And you know what? There was this collective, desperate sigh of relief all across Europe. But not everyone was celebrating. Back in the halls of Parliament, Winston Churchill stood up and delivered this blistering rebuke, calling the agreement exactly what it was, a total and unmitigated defeat. He warned that they had just put themselves in terrible danger. Churchill's warning came true with horrifying speed. The ink on the Munich Agreement was barely dry. We're talking just 6 months later when Hitler broke his promise and his tanks rolled into the rest of Czechoslovakia. And just like that, the illusion of peace for our time was completely shattered. Appeasement was dead.
So, with appeasement totally discredited and Hitler's true ambitions laid bare for all to see, the final dominoes began to fall. The stage was now set for the invasion that would finally ignite a world war.
Okay, so Hitler's next target was Poland. But to pull it off, he made a move that just stunned the world. He signed a non-aggression pact with his #1 ideological enemy, Stalin's Soviet Union. Publicly, it was just a promise not to fight each other, but secretly, hidden away in a secret protocol, was a gangster's deal. They agreed to carve up Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe between them.
With his eastern flank now totally secure, Hitler's path to war was clear.
And to do it, he was going to unleash a brand new kind of warfare, Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. This was not about slow, grinding trenches. No, this was all about shock and speed. The idea was to use concentrated punches of tanks and aircraft to just rip holes in the enemy lines, causing chaos and a rapid collapse from the inside.
And at dawn on September 1st, 1939, it began. Over 1.5 million German soldiers poured across the Polish border, putting the theory of Blitzkrieg into brutal, devastating practice. That was it. That was the final straw. Britain and France had guaranteed Poland's independence. 2 days later, on September 3rd, they finally honored that promise and declared war on Germany. The conflict the world had tried so desperately to avoid was finally here.
But the start of the war was strange. It didn't immediately explode into the global inferno we all imagine. It actually began with this eerie quiet, right before escalating with absolutely shocking speed.
See, after Poland fell, this weird quiet descended on the Western Front. For months, journalists called it the Phony War. But then, in the spring of 1940, the storm finally broke. Germany unleashed its Blitzkrieg on France and the Low Countries, and the result was just unbelievable. France, which was thought to have the most powerful army in Europe, just collapsed in 6 weeks.
By June of 1940, Nazi flags were flying over Paris. The situation couldn't have been more dire. Britain now stood completely alone, its army trapped and facing total annihilation, saved only by the flat-out miracle of Dunkirk, where a whole flotilla of civilian boats rescued them right off the beaches.
A year later, totally drunk on his own success, Hitler made his single greatest mistake. He turned on Stalin, betrayed their pact, and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. This incredible act of hubris doomed Germany to a two-front war against enemies with way more resources and manpower. It was a war they could never ever win.
And the final, massive peace fell into place about 6 months after that. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. That single act brought the industrial might of the United States roaring into the fight, transforming the European conflict into a true world war, and ultimately sealing the fate of the Axis powers.
So, there you have it, a series of gambles, all met with indecision and fear, that led directly to the deadliest conflict in human history. The policy of appeasement is, rightly, seen as a catastrophic failure. But it does leave us with a really difficult and honestly a timeless question. When you're facing down an aggressor, what is the alternative to giving in, other than going to war?